Hello, everybody. Today is the usual weekly Gateway API meeting. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody here. Just as always, be aware that this kind of meeting is under the CNCF, so it basically boils down to just being nice to each other. Also, if you want to enable your webcam, it would be great. If you don't mind, it's not a big deal. Before get started, I see a couple of people that might be new to this meeting. So if you want to take a couple of seconds to introduce yourself and say a few words, it would be great. If not, don't mind again. It's not a problem.
Hello, am I audible?
Hey,
Welcome.
welcome.
Hi, so I'm Shivam. I'm pretty new in the group and I just wanted to learn and see how things are going and want to learn about the SIG here. So that's
Cool.
um,
Very good to hear. Welcome.
Hey
Yeah,
guys, this is also my first meeting. It's great to see all you guys, and yeah, you don't know what else I can say. Looking forward.
Yeah, welcome.
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 Anybody else?
I can go. So yeah, also my first meeting. My name is Greg, and yeah, I'm from Red Hat. Just I guess getting started to getting involved, I suppose. Yeah, curious to see what's the meeting about. I guess that's it.
Cool.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you.
Hey, I'm Karthik. I work for Google. Yeah, I have a couple of discussion points around MTLS policies for mesh. Yeah, but otherwise, just excited to be here.
This is great. If you have any topics, as I say, that you want to discuss, feel free to put them into the meeting notes, and we'll go through them. Okay. I guess we can get started with the meeting items. The first one is, as always, checking where we are at with the new release. This gap, the scoping gap phase ends on this week, basically. So I guess that the first item is to check where we are at with the percentage-based request mirroring, which is led by Lior. I saw, Lior, you're here. So if you want to say a few words about it. Are you? Yes.
Just celebrating that this PR got merged after more than 30 days.
Cool.
So yeah, I mean, nothing much to say. This was the conformance, I guess. This was one of the things that was required to push it forward. I believe documentation would be required as well. But yeah, I could. I'll follow up later to see what else do we need.
Maybe the biggest thing for this group is we need implementations to pass the conformance test that just merged. I think you may have gotten 2 passing, but we need at least 3. I actually don't know how many you got passing, but I know we need to get to 3.
So Istio for sure is going to pass. So it caught a bug in Istio with the implementation, so that's good because that's what conformance for. So the fix is going to be next release, which is 125, and this is passing there. I think someone mentioned Cilium supports this as well, but I didn't get them to actually test it.
Okay. So officially Istio only for the time being, right?
Unless I'm aware of anyone else.
Yeah, so that means if anyone, if anyone is able to help get this across the line, one of the things you could do would be to add it to your implementation, add support for this feature. I think this is a pretty tiny one to support, but if you can, that would really help us out to get this one across the line.
Yeah, I cannot promise anything, but I try to push a little bit to see if we can make it in Kong, so that we have another implementation.
Thanks.
Great.
Okay, the second one is the backend TLS policy. Well, of course, the gap is completed, so I think that what's remaining actually is conformance and documentation. I don't know if Candace is here.
I am here. I'm continuing to work on the conformance test. I think the documentation is pretty good. And we have, so the conformance test I'm struggling with at the moment. I haven't had a lot of time to work on it, but I'm continuing to have some issues making it work. So I'm getting a lot of issues with something that's happening with TLS issues within the Echo Basic container that we use for conformance testing, and could use anybody that has some experience with that kind of stuff to take a look at my PR, try and see if they can see anything in there that would lead to an issue, and or reach out to me and help me out with it. That would be great. Once I get the normative test running, and the PR actually has 25 file changes, so it's a substantive piece of work, and there could be many different places that I've done something wrong. So could use anybody to take a second look at it and let me know if you can see where the issue might be. It's definitely in some in the way that I'm contacting the TLS server within the Echo Basic container for conformance. So if anybody has a minute to take a look at that, to take a look at the PR, or to chat with me, I would appreciate it.
Yeah, I do have a question, since you mentioned that the PR is pretty big. Is there any chance to split it up so that we can get more smaller PRs easier to be reviewed? Is it feasible?
At some point, I'm going to split up the changes to the Echo server, because that will need to be submitted first in order for us to change the actual code, because we'll need a new hash, git hash code for importing the image for the Echo Basic server. So that is something I do want to do. I don't feel like it's a huge PR to change, I mean, to review, but yeah, some of the changes for Echo Basic can be removed. If you want to, if anybody could take a look and make any suggestions about splitting it up.
Yeah. I'll take a look for sure. Okay, do you mind passing the link in the notes here?
Yep, it's in the last meeting, and I'll move it up to here.
Okay. Great, thank you.
Anybody have any questions or comments about it? Okay, that's it then.
Thank you. Next one is policy attachment. This is a memorandum gap. I saw that Guy is here, but with the other maintainers, we chatted about it, and we think that it doesn't make much sense to strictly follow the deadline that we have for gap scoping, because I mean, it's a memorandum gap, right? So we are not introducing new functionality, but we are just kind of documenting what we already have. Do you have any updates about it, Guy? Or yeah, Rob?
Yeah, I mean, I just jump in on that. I think the logic is basically that the next phase that we're going to be getting to in, well, a week or less is meant to actually do the API details for the gaps, right? And in this case, if you have a gap without any API changes, which is this one, then I think it's okay for your gap phase itself to continue until the end of API details and refinement, because yeah. So that's the general logic there. Hopefully it's reasonable, and would, I think it's overdue to call what we call policy attachment stable. So hopefully we can get some of the kinks worked out, and and get this one across the line.
And I'm glad it says that it doesn't follow the deadline. Thank you so much for that, because I wouldn't be able, to make it for January the 30th anyway. As some of you know, I'm just coming back from parental leave, which means that things are good at home, but it didn't go exactly to plan work-wise. So I still, in fact, I still have a couple of things, to get out of the way, to finish, by the proposal for the new tax of the gap. I've been working on a separate document, Google Doc, as some of you know, which we may have linked to the meeting note somewhere a few weeks ago. But if not, I'm more than happy to add it again. But anyway, I do need a few more days in order to turn that into a proper pull request. So thank you so much.
Thank you, and congrats.
Congrats.
Yeah, congrats. Welcome back.
Yeah. Then experimental. The first one is the coarse filter. This one had several reviews, and all the comments look resolved, so it looks pretty good.
This one has been hard for me to review because it's very well written, but because it contains so much detail, I feel like there's something that I'm missing in all the details. If you expand the very first
have
comment,
an AI summarize it, Rob. What?
Yeah, I know, right? But I think I'm one of the first people to review it, and if you expand my first comment, there's an interesting thread there that I don't know we reached a perfect conclusion on. I don't know that it's particularly unresolved, but there's this idea of how you handle a wild card, basically. And I am worried that the current iteration of the spec may be impossible to support with Envoy, which represents a non-trivial chunk of our implementations, because Envoy has special handling of a wild card, where basically there's this argument that a wildcard is a valid header, but also implementations like Envoy interpret a wildcard as match everything, which I can see both arguments here.
Nick's comment is such a wonderful understatement.
Yeah, this is a hard one to follow. Maybe I should have marked this as unresolved. It's not necessarily that it's not resolved. I would feel better if one or two more people had time to look at this and confirm that it's okay.
I guess that the people should be working on Envoy, because I think you mentioned that it's a Envoy specific problem, right? So it's.
I mean, I don't know that it's Envoy specific. There was someone who mentioned it from Envoy land, that for how they handle wildcards. I don't know how other implementations handle wildcards.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was the comment from Space Wander specifically. But there's a lot in this thread. I will say my initial comment was not the insightful one. The most insightful one, I would say, is Nick's comment further down. So don't feel like you need to start at my comment, but I think it is a really useful thread to.
Has John happened to take a look at this one?
He's commented on it a couple of times.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I guess he may have commented based on an AI summary, but it seems a little unlike John.
You can never be sure anymore.
Okay, and I remember there was another major point of discussion about the pre-flight requests. Yeah, it was a John comment, but again, it's
I think my point was more like, if we're going to say we need more reviews, do we have very specific people in mind that we can just ask to, like, literally on the review thing, like, bring them in?
Any volunteers? Well, while we're thinking about that, I think the thing Matteo is commenting about is also interesting, and it is my third comment actually, which is probably the thread you have open. I don't know, but it starts from the third comment I left, and it is about whether or not we want to have a default in the Kube API for, many, if not most, have a default. Implementations have a default of 5 seconds. Do we want to make that consistent by making it a default in our API, or do we want to fall back and let whatever implementation default define behavior here? This is one that I think also had some open questions.
There was another one that I was referring to, which is the return code for the pre-flight.
Oh, yeah, you're right.
That one is a bit tricky as well. I don't know. I mean, all the comments look resolved now, so it's kind of
I think some may have been resolved a bit early. Like I'm not for sure that action is needed, but I'm not for sure that they're actually resolved either. So it could be worth opening up some threads that there are questions about, just if we want a second opinion.
I tend to think that when it comes to timing things, that we should not dictate defaults.
Yeah,
I need to think about it a little bit more, but I think I agree with Shane on that.
Like, I could see a scenario where we optimize for the proxies we know today, but who knows? Maybe there's a proxy tomorrow that wants to do a crap load of generative AI and it takes them 10 seconds. Like, it just seems like timing is like, yeah, maybe we could know what today is going to be, if that works for like Envoy and Nginx, Linkerd 2 proxy. But
I mean, it's okay with me if we want to disallow generative AI crap. It just, that's fine. But we should probably
was meant to be a humorous example of something that would like drag out the timing. But the point just being like, we can't really predict what future proxies are going to do. And so timing things in particular feel like spots I don't really want to dictate defaults too much.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I honestly don't have a strong opinion about it. It may make sense though. Okay, so this one may need some additional checks. Let's move on. Retry budgets.
Actually, hang on a second. One other quick question. Rob, were you going to unresolve the conversation on 1767 that?
Yeah, let me resolve both of the ones that I'm aware of that I think could use some additional attention.
I would appreciate that, because there are a whole lot of conversations on here that have been resolved, and it's going to take a while to go through all of them.
Yeah, for sure. Good call.
Thank you.
Okay, the next one is retry budgets. Mike is here, or anyone who has some details about it?
I think I saw Eric.
Eric is here.
I think Eric's there too. Yeah.
Eric?
Hello.
Hey.
Yeah, so this past week we've been discussing in the PR a bit back and forth about the API design approach that we're going to take. And where we're at right now is that Mike and I would like to merge this PR as is and then work on a couple of proposed API designs for this, since I don't think we reached too great of a consensus in the discussion here.
What I think that's reasonable. I think I'd suggested something similar. What are the thank you for all the work you're doing on this, by the way. I know this is a tricky subject. Since this is our last meeting before before we want to have this merged in with API, do you want to talk through the options you're considering for API, so maybe we can get a little closer to consensus on this call?
Yeah, I mean, my initial approach was via policy attachment. I don't know if maybe Mike would want to add on here a bit. Just because I will say, admittedly, some of the discussion in this PR has gone a little over my head. Some things that I couldn't find much documentation about were brought up. So yeah, Mike might want to chime in there.
Sure. Yeah, there's definitely a couple comment threads in here that go off into some hypothetical things that have existed in conversations of maybe this is what the state of Kubernetes looks like in 2 or 3 years. But I guess the short summary is we're proposing to move forward with a policy attachment based design for this. I think that's going to be the best implementation that's going to kind of meet the expected functionality from a user perspective. And it's also going to conveniently map to existing implementations better than doing something in HTTP root. With that said, I think that there's 2 possible paths forward for policy attachment. One would be a distinct separate policy, like a retry budget policy or something like that. And the other implementation would be somehow merging this with other backend traffic policies. I'm kind of with Flynn on backend LB policy. Feels a bit too narrow a name. But if we want to have like a bigger policy thing catch-all, then maybe we introduce a new like backend traffic policy CRD or something like that could take the existing fields from backend LB policy as well as this and be intended for future extensibility for anything else that may be appropriate for that. So those are kind of like the 2 options I'm looking at. And then there's other discussion around if we're able to have extensions or mixins or gateways instead of services, like what does that look like and why is a policy still useful in those cases?
Or if a policy is still useful in those cases.
Yeah.
I would be happier with backend traffic policy than backend LB policy. I have been finding myself leaning more and more towards the idea that perhaps we should arrange it so that we have a thing that's not a service that we start pointing to people for as the target of a route, so that we can start addressing some of these things without constantly reaching for policy attachment. I think that's obviously a larger can of worms that we do not need to open for this particular gap, however. As much as I look forward to, no, I don't look forward to it at all. I just think it's going to be necessary. Guy, you were going to opine?
Yeah, thanks, Flynn. I was thinking on the one single kind of policy for multiple different concerns versus different kinds of policies, right? And one thing to have in mind, and given the experience we've been having, at least in Quadrant, is that even though it sounds appealing, the idea of having one single kind of resource, to effectively write controllers for, right, and to reconcile, for the user, at least the feedback we've been getting is it's usually harder, to configure and to use when you have one single super powerful kind of policy. Rather, it's usually easier when you have different kinds of policies, especially if you want to set up things like RBAC, for addressing the specific concerns. Just to give one example, right? So one thing to have in mind, it is typically easier, to implement the controller. So for the implementations, most of them would say, "Oh, at first it's preferable," but for the user, it's not always the same.
Guy, when you say the user, who does Quadrant consider the primary user? Which role?
Yeah, it's app developers and platform engineers. So amongst all the personas we have in Gateway API, those two are the focus. And in fact, we've been right now, discussing, yeah, correct. Yeah. So we've been right now discussing walking this path all the way around, right? So defining more specific kind of policies that build on top of the super powerful ones that we have to provide more use case driven abstractions instead of just enabling the full power of the kind of policy that we have. Just something to keep in mind.
Mm-hmm.
Something that I think that applies as well is the complexity of the policy of the policy status. I mean, the more information that the policy has, the more knobs it has, the more complex the status it gets, and all the conditions, right? So sorry, Rob, it was your time.
Yeah, no worries. I don't know. I'll play the other side a little bit in the sense that one of the most persistent bits of feedback I have heard about Gateway API is that it's too complicated. There are too many APIs. There are too many resources. I'm coming from service. I'm coming from ingress. I'm coming from things that just threw everything in one thing, and you've split it out way too far, right? And that's before people even get to policy. They're just talking about gateway class, gateway route, etc., right? And so my concern would be that if we have another policy just for this, and we set this precedent that every new concept in gateway that extends a service is a new policy, and it makes me very, very nervous. I think Mike mentioned an idea of a, like maybe we rename the existing backend LB policy to something like a bit more generic and share them between this and retry budget. I think that's my own personal preference, but I don't know. I just, well, I get that the most correct thing to do is to have a separate policy for every unique concept. I am worried that that is going to get very frustrating to users, or just maybe it's not even that it's frustrating to users. It just potential users take a look and decide not to even try the API because they've just seen this crazy mess of policy that they have to deal with.
It's
Agreed.
35 past the hour. We could very, very easily spend the next 3 meetings on this one specific can of worms. As I have noted in the notes, ultimately, Rob, you're dancing around the discussion of, is policy attachment really the right way to approach every freaking thing in the world? And I think we absolutely should have that discussion, but perhaps there are other things we should cover today in particular.
Yeah, you're completely right. Let's come back to this one if there's time. I'll note in a comment. I left a comment there suggesting that I also agree policy attachment is not the perfect. We don't want to. Policy attachment is very useful. We don't want to end up in a world where we have to use it for everything we want to configure at service level. So
Yeah.
that yeah, I left some comments there, but that is another rabbit hole. So let's leave that one alone for a bit.
Just one
Ultimately, I think that. Sorry, one moment, Lior. Ultimately, I kind of liked Mike and Eric's idea, or Eric and Mike's idea, about trying to land the discussion about retry budgets and then split out some of the specifics of the API design. I would be in favor of that because I think there are quite a few different ways we could approach the design of the API, and probably many of them are amenable to policy attachment or something else, which I'd like to explore a bit. Sorry, Lior, I cut you off. Please go ahead.
No, just you're good. I just wanted to say that I think for a while now we've been delaying this discussion. I'm just not sure how do we anticipate to get into a conclusion there, right? There are a lot of opinions, and if we're not kind of actively trying to only focus on policy attachments in a serious
No,
way.
I think we need to pick a time where that's the thing we're going to talk about, and then talk about it.
And it
Right.
probably ties into I think it's an issue that was opened a few days ago that Rob had linked to in one of the comment threads about Gateway as a potential replacement for service to
Right.
intermediate traffic to backend workloads. So we should probably schedule a discussion on a future agenda for specifically that topic and how that relates to policy attachment potentially.
Yeah, I plus one. I'm glad you mentioned that. That is what I'm hoping will be a big part of the solution here is the work that Pooja has presented already on the idea of cluster IP gateways. Hidden in there is the idea of a different kind of backend resource that is more focused on backends. And as we've said for many years now, the duality of service, the front end and back end, it's confusing. If we split those
And
up,
problematic.
yeah.
I'd also like to point out that the idea of having a resource type that is not a service to talk about the back end does not mean that that resource must be a gateway. It just means that, hey, what a concept. We can define another resource that means this thing that we currently have to use service for. And if we do that, we get a lot of interesting possibilities.
Yep.
Yeah. Anyway,
Okay.
let's pick a time to go and dive into this in detail. And we apparently have questions about TLS mode and MTLS for mesh. And oh dear God, Guy had another question about policy attachment. So we're all doomed anyway.
Yeah. First, there is the last item for the scoping phase, the authorization authentication, which will slip to the next release because it won't make it for this one. The initial draft has been merged here, but yeah, it's only the starting point. So even though it was a great effort from Nick, it's a big one. So it will be put off to the next one. Yep. TLS mod, Rob, this one is yours, and I'm afraid that the PR is mine. Yes.
Yeah, I think I saw you responded and I forgot, but this just felt like it needed a bit more discussion, and I don't really know what to say other than just it could use. We're back to the discussion of what TLS mode is allowed with what routes, and so there's some ambiguity here, I guess you could say. If this is something you care about, please take a look at the comments. I know we've got a fair number of things to go through, but yeah.
I just
Mattia, I owe you an apology
Yeah.
because I have thoughts on this one that I have not yet added to your PR, and I am sorry.
Oh yeah, sure. It's my intention here was to formalize what we have, not formalized yet in our documentation and gaps and API documentation. So it's as Rob said, if anyone is interested in giving opinion or whatever, feel free. The goal is to tackle the ambiguities about what routes can be configured with listeners using TLS with terminate, pass-through, and this kind of matter. Okay. Guy, policy attachment.
Yeah, that is such a specific question that I think it's fair to take this offline if you prefer. I could reach out to Nick and ask anyway. Just for the record, it's something we've been wondering about, a very specific statement that we found in GAP 713 about conflict resolution between policies targeting at the same level, that we don't really know if there is an actual use case behind, or if it's just that kind of thing that we when we try to solve a problem that doesn't really exist in real life. Right? So I'm not sure, but it says inside inherited policies, the same second bullet point, Mattia. Inside inherited policies, the same setting in overrides beats the one in defaults. Right? I think that statement makes total sense for when you have the hierarchy of network resources in mind. Right? When you have policies targeting different levels. We were just wondering if it still stands for when you have multiple policies at the same level. Let's say you have two policy resources targeting the same gateway, right? And one of them is an override, another one defines the defaults. We've been wondering if that's even a real use case. Why one who can define multiple policies at the same level, especially if it's not across namespace, but within the same namespace, right? Why would you define two policy resources rather than just modifying the existing policy resource that you have, right? And this is mainly relevant, for the work you're doing.
Eventually, someone's going to do it if it's possible.
Maybe that's enough, to say that maybe we should skip that one rule and say, just jump to the next one, right? Because once you start opening that door, right, and creating more and more rules such as this one, it becomes harder and harder, as you know very well, than to reason about this stuff, right? So if you have multiples at the same level, arguably we should stick with the oldest one, as the next bullet point says, right? But now we're also inspecting the internals of those policies and discussing what kind of merge strategy exactly that policy specifies, whether it's a default or an override, and pick one of those. Anyway, so as I said, this is a very specific. I could, reach out to Nick directly and ask, or take it offline some other way. But it just feels that there isn't really an actual use case for it. But I might be wrong.
So my opinion here is that we actually should split this into two rules and make it more clear that this is intended to be an ordered list. So I guess the sentence above this list makes it fairly clear this is in order. But what I would say is we kind of want this to be at the bottom of the list as well, in the sense of, if you've passed all these other conditions and you have a single inherited policy that sets both overrides and defaults, and they overlap, overrides wins over defaults.
Sorry, I think, sorry to interrupt you, Rob, but I think the very last thing that you said, I think we changed already. I think it was in 1.2 that we defined that a policy should specify either defaults or overrides, but not both of them. Or maybe I'm wrong. Originally, you're totally right. I think we could have both stanza within the same spec, but maybe I'm wrong. But if I remember correctly, I think we changed it then.
No, you're right. You're right. So I guess in this case, the only thing this covers then is the case where you have multiple policies, one sets overrides, one sets defaults.
Did we change that as a? Did we change that as a should, or did we actually change the validation? I don't.
Good question. I need to refer to the spec myself. That would be 2649.
Yeah,
I need
even if I think it makes perfect sense that it's weird to me to imagine setting overrides and defaults in the same policy, I did not think we had changed the validation to disallow that, but I could be very wrong there. So
Yeah, I'm not even sure if we have validation. I mean, proper validation in the API, right? Because given that we don't have inherited policies in the Gateway API ourselves, but meaning that should be somewhere in the spec. But
Yeah, I think
maybe you're right. I don't remember having that having been added to the spec. Maybe it was only in the discussion that we agreed upon.
Yeah, I
I
think
thought it was-
whatever we
Yeah.
have for conflict resolution needs to be broad enough that it can cover what we would consider invalid or undesirable configuration. Even if we say you shouldn't, we can't really prevent, and we can't really even ensure that everyone who does policy has the correct validation set up, or so
Yeah.
I think defining what wins in that case is still useful.
Okay.
And
Thank you.
Not to put words in Nick's mouth, but my understanding was always that the intent here was just trying to be explicit about the order in which you should interpret things. I never got the impression that there was a particular use case that anybody had in mind, just wanting to cover all the bases. Does that fit your memory as well, Rob?
Yeah, no, I think so.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. Last point is from Karthik. I apologize if I misspelled your name.
No, that's exactly right. Hi, I'm Karthik. This is my first time attending this meeting, so forgive me if I don't follow the proper protocol on anything. So I work for Google on Cloud Service Mesh, and I was researching MTLS policies for Gateway API for Mesh specifically, and realized that none exist today, right? Most meshes just, or all meshes just fall back to their native APIs, right? Most meshes have, if not all, have MTLS on by default, right? So this makes communication between services in the cluster or workloads in the cluster zero touch mostly. But however, if a user wants to override the default behavior, each mesh has like a different API, different capabilities. There's no standard pattern as of from what I've seen. Like for example, the two main use cases in my mind, there might be more out there, but are like basically how does a workload, what kind of traffic does a workload accept? Like, does it accept only MTLS, plain text, or permissive? And the other use case in my mind is like, how do clients talk to a destination service? Do they do plain text? Do they do MTLS? Or especially in the context of talking to external services that are not inside the cluster or that are not part of the mesh. There might be other use cases such as using custom certs or something to talk to these external services. Anyway, these are a couple of use cases that sprung to my mind, and I realized there's no API to represent them, right? I know a couple of meshes. I'm most familiar with Istio. Istio has explicit API to do all of these use cases that I mentioned. I think Kong does too. Linkerd also allows it, but I think it uses authorization policy to do some of these things, especially the workload permissive thing. And different meshes have different capabilities and different APIs. Some of them don't even have an API for these, right? So I don't want to go into proposals today, but I just wanted to gauge this community's interest in creating an MTLS policy for Gateway API for mesh workloads. So that the benefit would be that there would be a consistent single consistent API that would work across all meshes, in a unified way. I'll end my monologue here.
Mike, do you want to jump in or shall I?
You can, because I was zoned out trying to focus on something else.
Okay, Kartik, I would say that the current state of the world is that we have interest is probably not the limiting factor here. There are definitely situations where I think that people would be interested in creating such things. We have pretty deliberately decided that it probably makes more sense to approach these things in the context not just of the mesh, but of Gateway API in general, at least for the time being. Because most of the things that you're talking about are also things that we might need to worry about in the context of north-south as well as east-west. I see that Rob and Lior are both poised to jump down my throat for something I just said. So, Rob, why don't you go ahead and let's see
No,
how
I
far
mean, I
along
think I think
they
Lior
are.
probably beat me to it. I don't know who won, but Lior go first.
Well, on my screen, you're first. So
Whatever. Lior is more
Lior, go
familiar
ahead.
than I am here.
I just want to like, Flynn, can you relate to the? I'm not sure I'm following how this is 100% related to north south as well. For example, Kartik brought up an interesting use case. I know customizing search or defining traffic between like client from the cluster to an external
So
service or
customizing certificates falls very much into the wheelhouse of some of the stuff we've been talking about with backend TLS policy, right?
Yeah. No, but
Being able to talk, defining talking to external services and how you do with that. Honestly, there are ways I feel like that also dovetails into some of the stuff with backend TLS policy, because ultimately you're trying to talk about what does a workload do for TLS when originating a connection someplace. And that is a problem that you have everywhere in Gateway API, not just within the mesh. So that's where I feel like these things are Gateway API concerns rather than mesh concerns, in the way we've been thinking about them so far.
do you necessarily have to have a gateway though in order to, let's say, I mean, it feels like we're calling it, hey, we have to have a gateway if we want multi-cluster traffic, for example.
In Linkerd, you certainly don't have to have a gateway to do multi-cluster traffic, right?
That's why I'm interested in your opinion.
Sorry, let me be a little bit more cautious in how I say something. I don't want to say they are just north-south concerns. I just mean to say that I think that it probably is a thing that we are thinking about in the context of Gateway API as a whole. Gateway API as a whole right now doesn't really have a great way to talk about things like egress in general, right? We don't have a good way to talk about external workloads at all.
Yeah.
We are going to need that at some point, but when we need that, it's not just going to be a mesh concern, it will be a Gateway API concern.
And then within the mesh, if you want to override, let's say, certificate or some TLS settings for a client to talk to a group of servers, you would deploy a policy, right?
So the way Linkerd does this one is that we defined a thing called an egress network that can be the target of a backend. It can be wow, I can't talk. That can be the parent of something like a route, and then we can attach policy to that route.
Right. I mean, I think the point, and then probably going to be my last sentence, right? Because some people have probably more ideas, but I think the point is that all the meshes are able to do something. That's what Kartik brought up, but we don't have a unified way to do so. I think this all comes down to that, and whether it's valuable to have it as most of the other, features we're working to
5-minute warning.
Thank you, Shane. That's why I say, yeah, I think there's interest in this sort of thing. But in most cases, I think that it makes sense to think about it in terms of Gateway API as a whole rather than just mesh. So to your point there, yeah, meshes do need to talk about things like, is this workload allowed to talk to this other workload? But that's also a meaningful question for, should traffic from this gateway be permitted to this specific workload? It's not just a mesh thing. And that's the challenge in a lot of ways. If we do want to start thinking about it in terms of just mesh, then I mean, that might be a little bit easier. I'm not sure if that really makes a lot of sense. If we try to define some authorization policy mechanism that only works on east-west, that feels weird. If we start trying to talk about an authorization policy mechanism that works for north-south as well, we land back on the GEP that Nick and Jen got the memorandum in, and now we need to define how it's actually going to work. Yeah, so I don't know if that really helps, Kartik. It's a case of congratulations, you've found a lovely can of worms to open. Yeah, Rob, your hand is still up. Did you have more to add, or did you just forget to put it down?
Yeah, unfortunately, yeah, we probably should wrap this conversation up, but this is at least the second conversation of the day that feels like it could use a more focused, longer discussion, because I think there's more to say. Maybe it's worth, I know it's just a subset of people here that are really interested in this, but for those that are, maybe it's worth organizing some kind of follow-up discussion on this.
Or maybe starting from the creation of a GitHub discussion, just to
that's what a novel concept. Yeah, let's just do a GitHub discussion first, and we can go back and forth there, and maybe that leads to a meeting or discussion in person after.
I'm not a very much pro of GitHub discussions. Is it like when things are? So I know it's a way to start things, but like I guess if a lot of people already have their opinions right now, and this thing had been brought up before,
it's a good way to collect. It's a good way to collect thoughts so that everybody can start on the same page, rather than spending a bunch of time on the in-person synchronous meeting going over the same ground and then having people say, "Oh yeah, I agree with that." So, I think we're gonna end up in a synchronous meeting on this one, but I think that writing a bunch of stuff down in the first place is probably a good idea.
Speaking about time, we have 2 minutes left. So Rob, if you want to go,
thanks
with your last one.
Thanks for squeezing this one in. I know I'd been mentioning this at various points that we need some TLS updates to clean up how we handle connection coalescing. And this is admittedly a rush gap. It's also admittedly one that doesn't necessarily, it's on the borderline of needing a gap. It's kind of combining a few relatively small changes into a gap. But the big thing that this proposes actually defers it to gap 91 for the client TLS validation, which is something that it says should move to top level, but should be covered in gap 91 and not this. This has another couple small changes. I would really like to get this into 1.3 because I think it is a pain point and is going to lead to a lot of confusion for anyone that runs into this. Yeah, as a summary, it proposes documenting the problem, more clearly recommending that implementations return 421s when they run into it, and then providing a common gateway condition that is expected to be in status basically when users have configured something that is likely to have this problem. And that's all I'll say. But reviews very appreciated. I know this doesn't have a lot of time, but yeah, hopefully we can get this one through.
It's okay, Rob. There's nothing controversial about this.
Nothing at all. I mean, hopefully, in fairness, we did already have some fairly in-depth discussions about this, and this is me just trying to take those AIs and turn them into action items and turn them into reality, but we'll see.
I mean, it looks like you're just writing down the outcome of the earlier meeting, which I appreciate. Thank you.
Well, thank you. We are at time. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and see you next time.
Enjoy.
Cheers.
Thanks.
Cheers.